You were never meant to be here. The world was built to keep you small, to make you believe that power belonged only to those born into it, that control was something inherited, not claimed. They wrote the rules before you ever had a say, shaping reality in their image, ensuring that you, ordinary, invisible, replaceable, would never rise. But here you are, not just seen, not just heard, but unstoppable. You were told that change was impossible, that resistance was futile, that those who ruled from the shadows would always hold the reins of the world. They counted on your silence, on your doubt, on your fear. But what they never understood is that you were never waiting for permission. You were never meant to follow. You were built to break the cycle, to rewrite the script, to turn the impossible into reality. And now, as they sit in their secret chambers, their hands trembling over reports they can no longer ignore, the truth presses down on them like a weight they have never known. They are losing. The game they have mastered for generations has been disrupted. The illusion they built is collapsing. And for the first time, they are the ones afraid. Because the world no longer belongs to them. It belongs to you. They gathered in urgency, faces drawn tight, with unspoken concern. For years, they had dictated the course of existence, but now, something was slipping beyond their reach, something they had not accounted for. Their power, once absolute, had begun to fracture. The forces they had long dismissed as irrelevant were no longer scattered, no longer powerless. Once, you were just another solitary figure, weighed down by an edifice designed to keep you in submission. But there was something within you that could not be measured, something beyond their calculations. It was not inherited status or material excess. It was an unrelenting force, an instinct to withstand, to push forward when all others recoiled. While others hesitated, you stepped in. Where resignation was expected, defiance took root. They had seen struggles before, observed uprisings from the safety of their high towers. But this time was different. This time, the walls they had built to keep control were showing cracks. Dear brothers and sisters, may God's peace be with you. Remember this truth. Our lives are anchored in His divine plan beyond worldly concerns. As Scripture says, "Give, and it shall be given unto you." Luke 6:38. Like a mighty oak, we stand firm in His strength. Now, you have the opportunity to step into that blessing. When you use the super thank you button and give $100, know that His abundance will return to you 100-fold. At first, it was subtle, an ember barely visible against the vast machinery of suppression. But embers spread, and soon the fire was undeniable. Words turned into action, silence into resistance. The very structures that had dictated reality for generations began to weaken. The illusions they had spent centuries crafting, unraveled as undeniable truths, emerged from beneath the surface. You had refused to conform to their expectations, had torn through the carefully designed framework that ensured their continued dominance. And worst of all for them, you were no longer alone. The isolated voices that had once been dismissed as insignificant now resonated together, forging something they could neither control nor contain. The tools of their dominion, fear, manipulation, division, began to erode under the weight of something greater. Now, as they review the numbers, the reports, the projections they once trusted, it is clear. This was not a statistical anomaly, not an aberration to be dismissed. It was a shift, a tide they had no means of stopping. At first they scoffed, not in public, not openly, but in the privacy of their secured spaces, behind veils of opulence and whispered reassurances. They had seen challenges before, and had always found ways to silence them. To them, you were just another temporary disturbance, another movement fated to rise and fall before fading into irrelevance. They had rewritten history to bury those who had dared to defy them before. Why should this time be any different? They dismissed the momentum, the fury, the raw determination as nothing more than an inevitable cycle, a brief flicker before extinction. After all, how could individuals with no wealth, no influence, no established power possibly dismantle the architects of the world? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Psalm 118, verse 22, they thought they had it all figured out. The architects of power, the ones who built this world in their image, had convinced themselves that they knew how the story would end. They had seen it before, resistance rising, only to fizzle out like a candle in a storm. It was predictable, inevitable. They told themselves that every rebellion, every uprising, every flicker of defiance would crumble beneath the weight of the system they had perfected. And why wouldn't they believe it? For centuries, they sat above it all, watching as challenges were swallowed whole, as movements burned bright and burned out just as quickly. It was almost amusing to them, the way people kept trying, fighting against a machine too massive to break, against an empire too vast to fall. They had built their kingdom on wealth, influence, and control. They had set the rules and made sure no one else had the power to change them. But what happens when the stone they dismissed, the force they ignored, becomes the very foundation of something new? What happens when the ones they overlooked, the ones they never accounted for, stop playing by their rules? At first, they watched from a distance, convinced that this too would pass, that you would fade into another forgotten struggle. They believed time would do the work for them, that all they had to do was wait, and you would buckle under the pressure, fall in line, disappear. But you didn't. The fire didn't go out, the storm didn't fade. The weight they had relied on to crush you only made you stronger. They had seen disruption before, but never like this. They had seen protests, movements, resistance, but never a force that refused to break, that adapted, that grew beyond their ability to control. The system they had spent lifetimes perfecting, the one that had always served them so well, was now slipping through their fingers. The walls they built to keep power in place, to keep you in place, were cracking. And they weren't just facing opposition, they were facing something far worse. They were facing a shift, a real, undeniable, irreversible shift. The game they thought they had mastered was breaking apart in ways they had never foreseen. The patterns they trusted, the tactics they had counted on, the lies they had fed the world for generations, none of it was working anymore. And for the first time, the story wasn't following the script they had written. For the first time, their certainty had failed them. And for the first time, they weren't the ones in control. And now, as they gather around their meticulously arranged figures and polished reports, a foreign sensation settles in, a creeping unease they had long believed themselves immune to. What they once dismissed as a mere flicker had swelled into something undeniable, something that refused to be contained. It had begun subtly, a single anomaly buried deep within their carefully monitored systems, a deviation they assumed was a fluke, but then another, and another. Anomalies do not repeat themselves in perfect succession. This was no accident. This was no isolated breach. This was the fracture of something they had once believed indestructible. And the most unsettling realization, the force unraveling it all, had never been a part of their equation. You were never meant to be here, never meant to disrupt. never meant to touch the levers they had spent generations reinforcing. Yet here you were, peeling away the layers, dismantling their hidden frameworks, exposing the weaknesses they had taken such pride in concealing. You are here for a reason. If you feel the call, answer it. Click join to unlock exclusive content, deep insights, and a powerful community. This isn't just a membership. It's an awakening. Step into your divine purpose. Join the chosen. They sat motionless as one of their most powerful instruments was dismantled. Not by an empire of equal wealth, not by an elite adversary with comparable influence, but by something they had spent centuries ignoring. A voice. One voice, unshaken, relentless. The very people they had spent generations conditioning were no longer following the path set for them. Doubt seeped into the cracks of their once flawless control. The realization clawed at them in the dim glow of their vaulted chambers, in the cold hush of meetings where even the air seemed to betray their confidence. Their dominion had never been challenged like this, not by force, not by war, but by something more dangerous, the dissolution of the illusion. You had not come to ask for a place in their hierarchy, had not waited for permission to be acknowledged. You had overturned the foundation itself, breaking through the walls they had once deemed impenetrable. And now, for the first time, they felt something alien settle into the spaces between them, a loss of certainty, a recognition of vulnerability. Their fortress was not as untouchable as they had believed. The fracture had formed, and you were still pressing forward. No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn. Isaiah 54:17. They never thought you would make it this far. They built this world like a fortress, brick by brick, law by law, deception upon deception, ensuring that no one, not you, not anyone, could ever challenge their rule. They told themselves their power was divine, that it was written in the fabric of history, that nothing could shake the ground beneath their feet. Their dominion was absolute, their control unshakable. And for a long time, it was. But power isn't real unless people believe in it. And now, that belief is slipping. They told you resistance was useless, that the weight of the system would crush you, that you'd grow tired and fall in line like all the others before you. They counted on your exhaustion. They counted on your surrender. But what they never expected was your endurance. What they never understood was that you weren't just another voice, another nameless face, lost in the crowd. You weren't a passing rebellion, a momentary disruption. You were something else entirely. They built their kingdom on division, on keeping people apart, on making sure the masses never realized their true strength. They needed people to fight each other so they would never think to fight them. But something changed. You saw through it. You saw that their greatest fear was not your anger, not your defiance, not even your resistance. No, what terrified them most was the idea of you coming together, of people standing side by side, not as enemies, but as something unbreakable. And once you understood that, there was no stopping what came next. They tried everything: distraction, manipulation, fear, but nothing worked. Every time they tried to silence you, your voice grew louder. Every time they tried to erase you, your presence became more undeniable. They thought they could control the narrative, that they could twist the truth into whatever shape they pleased, but the illusion they crafted so carefully was cracking before their eyes. Their allies, the ones who had stood by them for decades, were hesitating. The institutions they had built were crumbling under the weight of a truth they could no longer contain. Their perfect system, the one that had served them so well, was failing. And now, for the first time, they are not the ones setting the course of history. They spent their lives believing they were untouchable, believing they could bend reality itself to their will. But they were wrong. Because no amount of money, no amount of control, no carefully written law or tightly held secret could stop what was coming. And they know it. They can feel it in the way their grip is slipping, in the way the world is shifting, in the way their own power is starting to turn against them. They have ruled for generations through control. But you don't need control. They have built their empire on fear, but you don't need fear. Because what you have, what you've always had, is something they could never take. And that is why, no matter what they do next, no matter how desperately they claw to hold on, they are fighting a battle they have already lost. For the first time in their history, they were not gathered to strategize, not to dictate the fate of industries, or dismantle another rising challenge with calculated precision. No, tonight, there was only one matter that consumed them: you. Their voices, when they finally spoke, did not carry the weight of untouchable rulers, but the tension of those standing on unstable ground. This was no passing disruption, no minor insurrection to be smothered in its infancy. This was something they had not accounted for, something they had refused to believe was possible. And if we don't act now, we lose everything. The admission sent a shudder through the room. Never before had they needed to acknowledge the possibility of failure. Never before had they uttered the words that now tasted bitter on their tongues. The same fear they had wielded as a weapon for generations, the same fear they had used to keep entire civilizations in line, was now staring back at them from their own reflections. And the most terrifying truth of all, they did not know the full extent of what they were facing, because you were not something they could track, nor something they could contain. You were not simply a force they could outmaneuver, not merely an ideology they could distort. You were something far worse for them, because you were inevitable. The weight of realization pressed against the walls, thickening the air as voices clashed in frenzied debate. The future no longer bowed to them, it had slipped from their grasp. Panic had given way to a cold, calculated urgency. Fear, though lingering in the corners, had been forced aside in favor of something far more dangerous: strategy. They had never been in this position before, forced into defense, scrambling to salvage what remained of their dominion. The rules had changed, and yet they were not ready to accept defeat. We still have options. The words cut through the discord, steady, authoritative. Desperation was not an option, not yet. This empire had been constructed meticulously, deception woven into its foundation, control upheld by invisible chains. They had navigated unrest before, had seen movements rise and fall like the tide, always managing to stay above the waves. The question was no longer whether they could halt you, but how. Some in the room still clung to old methods, their voices sharp with frustration. Crush them outright, shut them down, dismantle everything they stand for, financially, socially, physically, if necessary. We've done it before, but others knew better. The usual tactics were failing. Every restriction had only made you more determined. Every attempt at silencing you had amplified your presence. The more they pushed against you, the stronger you became. Direct confrontation was no longer an option. We can't attack them head-on. That's exactly what they expect. The murmurs of agreement began slowly, then gathered momentum. If suppression no longer worked, then perhaps corruption would. A more insidious approach. Divide them, redirect their energy, twist their unity into discord. Elevate the right voices, offer them influence, security. power. Make them believe they are set apart from the rest. Find their leaders, those who speak the loudest, and whisper into their ears. Convince them they can rise above their cause. And if persuasion failed, there was always another route. Turn them into something the world would fear. Let the public see chaos, not revolution. Shift the narrative until their movement became the very thing it had fought against. The strategy was set. The war was not over. But for the first time, they were no longer the ones dictating the terms. For nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest, neither anything hid that shall not be known and come abroad. Luke 8:17. They thought they could keep their secrets buried. They thought that if they controlled the story, they could control the world. That if they decided who the villains were, who the heroes were, then no one would ever question them. For generations, they held the pen that wrote history, shaping reality itself to serve their purpose. Truth was never about what was real. It was about what they declared real. It was about what they told the world to believe, and they were good at it. When the people got too close to the truth, they rewrote the script. When someone stood up and refused to bow, they didn't strike them down. Not right away. No, they turned the world against them. They whispered into the right ears, planted the right stories, made sure that by the time the truth reached the people, it was so twisted, so distorted, that no one would believe it anymore. And they would watch from their towers, from their hidden chambers, as good men were torn apart by those they had tried to save. It had worked before. It had always worked before. But something was different this time. The room was still, not with hesitation, but with calculation. There was no fear, not yet, because fear was reserved for those who had lost control. And they had spent their lives mastering the art of control. The silence that settled over them was not uncertainty. It was strategy. They were not panicking. They were planning. Because if they could not stop you, they could turn you against yourself. We don't need to fight them. We just need to make them fight each other. The words carried weight, not because they were new, but because they were familiar. This was an old trick, a tried and true method. Division was always the answer. Make them question one another. Make them doubt. Let paranoia do the work for them. All they had to do was wait. But what they didn't understand, what they still refused to grasp, was that the rules had changed. This wasn't the same world they had ruled for generations. The strategies that had worked for so long were now backfiring. Every lie they planted was unraveling faster than they could spin another. Every deception they wove was falling apart in the light of day. The whispers they relied on to shape perception were now turning against them, because people were no longer blindly listening. Their power was not slipping, it was imploding. The more they tried to twist the truth, the more people saw through it. The more they tried to divide, the more people united. Every manipulation, every well-placed rumor, every carefully orchestrated betrayal was backfiring in ways they had never anticipated. They had always believed themselves to be untouchable, to be beyond consequence. But now, they were realizing the truth. The same weapons they had wielded for so long, the same tactics that had once been their greatest strength, were now their greatest weakness. And for the first time, they were not the ones pulling the strings. For the first time, they were the ones being undone. They operated in shadows, believing secrecy to be their greatest advantage. But what they didn't understand was that their every move had already been accounted for. While they whispered strategies behind locked doors, you had already seen them coming. They had every conceivable advantage: wealth beyond measure, institutions at their command, influence embedded in every layer of society, and yet, despite all of it, they were losing. And they couldn't understand why. Because there was something in you that could not be bought, something beyond their reach. They had spent their lives believing power was something to be hoarded, something tangible, measured in numbers and assets, secured behind high walls and armed gates. But the force they were up against did not exist within those confines. It could not be stored, could not be owned, could not be stolen. It lived in defiance, in resilience, in an unshakable will that no amount of manipulation could extinguish. Control had always been their weapon, but it was also their weakness. They ruled through fear, but fear had lost its grip. They wielded division like a blade, but unity had dulled its edge. They had mastered the art of corruption, yet found themselves facing something they could not taint. And now, as they grasped for a world that was slipping through their fingers, the truth stood undeniable. They were not fighting against another empire to overthrow, another system to subdue. They were up against something entirely different, a movement that did not seek to control, did not hunger for power, but sought something far greater. And that made it unstoppable. Strength was never in permanence, only in the illusion of it. They had built an empire on perception, on the belief that their rule was unshakable, that questioning their authority was futile. But the moment that illusion was tested, fractures appeared where none were ever supposed to exist. Every institution they had constructed, economic, political, social, was showing signs of failure in ways they had never accounted for. The structures they once controlled no longer commanded loyalty, only suspicion. The fear they had cultivated for generations was now turning against them, a weight dragging them under instead of keeping others in line. They had spent their existence weaving a reality in which their power was absolute, a monument standing tall only because no one had dared to challenge its foundation. But now, the cracks were impossible to ignore. The pillars of their dominance were no longer holding steady. Alliances that once stood unwavering were unraveling. Secrets that had long been buried were spilling into the open. They were watching their creation collapse, and this time, there was no way to rebuild it. It was never about losing control. It was about the world finally seeing that their power had never been real to begin with, and once exposed, it could never be restored. Because authority is only as strong as the belief that upholds it, and you had shattered that belief forever. The truth had broken through their carefully crafted deception. They were not untouchable, not divine architects of the world's destiny, just desperate men trying to salvage what was already lost. Their era was ending. The only question that remained was what would take its place. And this time, that answer did not belong to them. Decisions had been made. The meeting was drawing to a close, but there was no resolution, only a quiet understanding of the battle ahead. They knew what they had to do, to reclaim their slipping grip on the world, just as you knew what had to be done to break free of it once and for all. This moment would be the one that defined everything. They would not surrender easily. Desperation made them dangerous. Every weapon at their disposal, deception, infiltration, sabotage, would be turned against you. They would reshape the story as it unfolded, casting themselves as the victims, painting you as the danger. They would twist reality to make the world question everything you stood for. Their goal was simple: to make you doubt yourself, to make you believe that victory was an illusion, that the fight was already lost. But you had seen too much, come too far to fall for their illusions again. The fear they had ruled with for generations had changed hands, and now As the last confrontation began, a single question remained. Would history remember this as the final struggle of a dying world, or the first chapter of something entirely new? The old was fading, but the new had yet to take form. The outcome was unwritten, and in the end, only one question mattered: who would hold the pen?